and the Muslims of the South. Wasn't exactly a conflict between the South because all they were victims of the conflict. In the university, I have more time for these sessions. In fact, in teaching the history of the Western Sudan, I teach a course on African history, and the first part of the course is from the origin of man to 1600, and the second is from 1600 to the present. Therefore, I have an entire year to teach the history, a survey course of the history of Africa. And each course is 30 sessions. So it takes 60 sessions to do what I am covering in 10 sessions. You understand that I'm condensing quite a lot, but I'm trying to get across the essence of what Africa was before the Europeans touched it. And this is what you have to know. And to understand, even if you understand the series, The Africans, you have to have read a lot of African history to understand the omissions. He throws in a lot of good things to disguise the fact that he's leaving out a lot of good things. And he is not telling African history chronologically. He's skipping here and there and giving you little tidbits. And yet, he is downgrading it in some places and upgrading it in other places. He is one of the most unique Islamic con artists that has come along in years. But he never fails to throw in a good piece for Islam. He is running a unique game. I am not saying that there's not some good things in there. If you listen well, there's some good things. In the fourth session, he begins by downgrading the numbers of African slaves taken out of Africa, about 12 million. He must be absolutely crazy. Du Bois' statistics is from 60 to 100 million in his examination of the records at the end of the 19th century. And they've been examined since then. And Cora, the Nigerian historian, it must have been as much as 200 million. And in the movement of Africans from the hinterland to the coast, I saw figures and statistics this summer that proves that 7 out of 10 died in the movement from the hinterland to the coast. And at one lone fortress alone, Gorée, that's the French fortress, 20 million passed through that one. You got 36 slave forts, and 20 million passed through Gorée. And he said 12 million altogether. Then he asked the question about the Arab slave trade. He said there's only 2 million Africans in the Arabian Peninsula now. So what happened to these Africans? He wouldn't ask that question to a competent historian. A competent historian would know. The UNESCO investigation into slave trade in the Indian Ocean proves that 30 million Africans were taken out of East Africa for one given period. But if you haven't done your homework, you wouldn't know. Then he said, now what happened to these Africans? Where are they now? If there's only 2 million in the Arabian Peninsula now, and he asked, where are they? Someone knows where they are and know where they went. Now he assumes that most people don't know, and he's right. Most people don't know. Because most people don't know about the millions of Africans who went into Asia. Africans who became slaves to the Maharajas of India and formed the armies of India, because the Iranians who conquered India did not trust local armies. And many of the Africans rose to high positions in India. One became governor of Bengal, Malacca. Another one rose so high as a general, they named a river after him, Ganges. Some scattered through the Pacific and can be seen, our relatives can be seen in the Pacific to this day. Some joined the black population and took over an entire continent called Australia. And the British found the whole black continent when they got there and killed almost all of them. They found a neighboring island called Tasmania, and they killed every single person on Tasmania. Another book on it called Last of the Tasmanians. Every single person on the island was killed. Man, woman, and child. When somebody talk about their Holocaust, remember, at least they're here to talk about it. All the Tasmanians are gone. Total Holocaust. We haven't done our homework. But at least the series is better than Tarzan. Notice how he praises the northern African countries like Algeria. Notice how uniquely he downgrades countries like Ghana and Nigeria. Notice how he downgrades in the so-called the Christian nations. Notice how he upgrades the Muslim countries. It's a cunning game. Very unique. But there was another series done by Basil Davis, and it's far better than that one. But you're not going to see that one because that was done by an Englishman and a white man. See, sometimes we get into color games and don't know what we're doing to ourselves. Basil Davison, every time Basil Davison came to a critical part of history, he put an African historian before the camera to explain, and he did a good job of it. Basil Davison's series was far more honest and more historically true than the one with Ali Mazrui. Ali Mazrui is descendant of Omani Arab slave traders, the most vicious of the African slave traders. If you don't know the history, you don't know this, you think you're seeing something that's good. And there are enough good pieces in the series to make a whole lot of people think that they're actually seeing something good. I'm not saying don't see it by all means. There are quite a few good things in it. What's left out is another story. All right, let's get to work on what we have to do tonight, because we've got more before us than we've got time before us. What I'm talking about tonight is not only the missing pages of African history, but some of the missing pages of the history of the world. After the decline of the Roman Empire, forced by the rise of Islam and the pushing of the Europeans out of North Africa and the Mediterranean, more than 1,000 years of history got neglected from the history of the world. When African genius in state building began to decline in the Nile Valley, African genius in state building was reborn in the Niger River. And another great river civilization was born. This great river civilization have been left out of history. Entire history books, even history of Africa, has been written with this great river civilization left out. Left out because people are stupid enough to call this Black Africa. Never use the word Black Africa, not because Africans are not black. Black is an honorable word. There's nothing basically wrong with it. But because it presupposes that there is a legitimate white Africa. There is no legitimate white Africa. And so somebody says Black Africa, ask them, what other kind of Africa legitimately is that? You never say white Europe, and you never say wet rain. What other kind of rain is there other than wet rain? That's redundant. It's just like saying blue sky, blue sky. All right. My main point here is that when you look at the genius of Africa, that genius, once it declines in one place, is reborn in another place. And when you look at the continents of the world, and look at the people in the world, nearly all civilizations are born near great rivers. When you look at Africa and you look at the civilizations of Africa, first the civilization of the Nile River, then the Niger River, then the Volta River, then the Congo River. Then again on the east is the Limpopo and the Zambezi River. You go to China, China is the Yangtze River. Go to Europe, it is the Danube River and the Volta River. Go to England, it is the Thames River. Every time you go to a continent and look at and look for the beginning of a civilization and the beginning of a great city and a commerce, you find the river and the city on the river. Now we are examining a great civilization in Africa that had its birth after Egypt. To some extent, it is as old as Egypt, but it came to the attention of the world after Egypt. And to some extent, it benefited from the aftermath of Egypt. This is Nile Valley civilization that had its birth and flourished after Egypt. It is also a civilization whose people benefited from a river civilization that flourished in the green Sahara before it became a desert. You do not say Sahara Desert because the word Sahara means desert. Years ago, before the area dried up, cities existed in the area, and there were rivers in the area, water in the area, and it could support large population. There were cattle and life. All of this has been proven, especially in a book by a Frenchman, André Lowe, in Search for the Tisilla frescoes. Frescoes mean pictures. And he was searching for the cave drawings in the Sahara that indicated the kind of life that existed in the area before it dried up and became a desert. He also found something that Herodotus indicated in his writing, that a people lived in that area of Africa called the Garamantes. Herodotus indicated that the Garamantes went to war using a three-wheel chariot. Herodotus was wrong. Europeans think that everything that moves, moves for war because Europeans are war conscious. What he thought was a war chariot was nothing but a utility wagon that Africans used to bring crops from the field. All of this, in spite of the fact that there was a French historian, Raymond Monet, who went around the world, was calling himself world's greatest authority on Africa, who will forever saying, until the 16th century, the African never knew the wheel. And at a meeting in Canada, when the African Young Turks stopped the meeting of the African Studies Association in the middle of his speech, told him, the meeting is illegitimate, you are illegitimate, get the hell out of here. He said, young man, do you know who I am? I am the great authority, Raymond Monet. Said, you are illegitimate, you are fake, get the hell out of here. He's never been the same since, almost had a stroke. Someone later told him that, and I was the one that told him this, there were African chariot drivers in Rome, there were African gladiators, some Africans were in the arena being killed as Christians, and some Africans was driving chariots killing Christians, and I'm sure that their chariots had wheels. That was before the 16th century. I guess he's retired or dead, but it doesn't matter a great deal. But the African had known the wheel for quite a while, in spite of Raymond Monet's proclamation that until the 16th century, he didn't know the wheel. And he had a research institute in Senegal up until about 5 or 6 years ago, when they had the common sense to fire him. All right, now, my main point, I'm trying to show that before Ghana, a nation existed in the southern area that became the Sahara before Ghana. And this is the preface for Ghana. And all this activity was taking place when the Romans were in retreat And as the Romans were in retreat, this is 300 years before the Roman retreat, and that this activity in this part of Africa is unfolding as the preface to the beginning of the state of Ghana, and that Egypt, while in decline, is not exactly Egypt, because this is the country that the Greeks would later call Egypt, and that the ancient Egyptians never called their country Egypt. They call it Tamari, Kemet, Egyptus, and the word Egypt came from the word Egyptus, called by the Greeks. But now, as Egypt began to decline, and as the Roman period came to an end, and as Islam began to push, Islam and the Arabs began to push the Europeans out of North Africa, the rebirth of a new civilization began to occur in the valley of the Niger. But the activity that I've been alluding to occurred 300 years before the Roman decline, 300 years before the birth of Islam. But with the birth of Islam, Ghana as a state in the Western Sudan had already occurred and was a flourishing state at the time. Now, as they pushed themselves, meaning the Arabs and the Berbers and the Africans, as they pushed themselves into the Mediterranean and into Spain, the activity in Ghana is beginning to take place. Now, the history of Ghana is told in many ways. And the first history comes from a Spanish Arab, Ilfasan, and his history is called Roads and Ruins. Now, the curiosity about Ghana has reached Europe. And when it reached Europe, an Italian king named Raja has an Arab to write a book about this curious country because it is called the gold country. Ghana stands astride the gold producing area in West Africa, and the roads from the Sahara into the gold country. And because they are the masters of the gold country, and anyone coming into the gold country must go through Ghana and pay a tariff, and they are rich, and they have kings who command the gold country, and they have a standing army of great consequence. They become known to Europe of that day, and everyone is curious because they cannot get into the gold country, and everybody wants their wealth, and no armies can penetrate this country. So now this king has an Arab to go into the country to see if he can penetrate it. But this Arab has already gone into the country. He hadn't been able to take out anything. But this Italian king named Roger hires him to write a geography book explaining the country. And he writes this geography book and he calls it the Book of Roger. As kings then who wanted information hired people to write books especially for them. Now you have the second book explaining ancient Ghana in the Western Sudan, in the states bordering on the Sahara, to the people of Europe. The third book is written by another Tunisian Arab, El-Omari. All right, now, they learned later that Fulanis are living on the border of the country, and because of the poor translation of a word called loco, the assumption is that the country is ruled by whites. And many black scholars who are too lazy to do their homework, including John Hope Franklin, he says the country originally was ruled by white kings. Now the word loco, because they said the country was ruled by loco Ethiopians. The word loco meant alabaster then at one time, but it meant foreign Ethiopians. Now, if you do your homework, you will discover that these foreign Ethiopians were Africans who came from outside of the area. Now you've got to do your homework and do your anthropology. You've got to study African customs to get at the heart of it. Foreign Ethiopians means Africans who came from outside of the area. If you understand your cultural anthropology, you will understand something else. In Africa of that day, and sometime in this day, royalty is interchangeable. If you're royal in one place, you can be royal in another place. If there's a weak royal system in one place, if a strong king shows up and wants the job, he can get the job. So some people invaded from the Volta River, people called the Musis, still in existence. And they invaded ancient Ghana in the 3rd century. They took over the kingship. In the period from the 3rd century to 770 is called the period of the Musi dynasty. There's a little book in paperback by Adu Boan, a Ghanaian writer, called Topics in West African History. He explains this. There's another book, African Glory. There's at least 10 books when all this is explained. The period of the Musi dynasty is noted for quite a few interesting things we have to look at. Arabs came down into ancient Ghana and lived in peace along with their religion that was at odds with African religions, which proves that Africans were very tolerant of religions not of their own choosing. After 70 AD, Jews had a difference of opinion with the Roman Empire, and the Jews and the Romans dispersed them, and they came down into ancient Ghana and lived among the people of Ghana, and they lived from the 3rd century until 770. And when it was discovered that they were collaborating with the Arabs to take over the state, they were expelled. This is important. It's important because this shows that a diversity of people with a religion alien to that of Africans can live among Africans for hundreds of years so long as they respect the dignity of African people without being put upon, make a living, follow a separate religion, so long as they respect the dignity of Africa. But once they decided they want to take over the state of their host, the Africans said, in essence, get the hell out of here. Now, this is partly documented in a book called Hebrewisms of West Africa. It proves something else which Jews are not willing to face and blacks are not willing to face. That down through the history, we have been their friends, we have been naive about them, and they have never returned the friendship or sent us a thank you note. Now I can go back further to the entry of Abraham into Egypt, but that's enough. The main point here is that while the period of the Musi dynasty was a period of progress, it was a period of foreign rule. 770, the local dynasty grew strong enough to drive out the Musis. And the local dynasty came to power. And these were the people called the Sonokes or Saracoles. Now, the period from 770 AD to the period of the invasion of Ghana, 1076, is the golden age of that great state. It was invaded from what is now Mauritania, then the kingdom of the Susus, by an Islamized black named Abu Bakr. Let's look at Ghana under its own steam. Let's look at Ghana while it was being ruled by its indigenous kings called the Sonokes of Saracoles. What happened during this building period of that state ruled solely by its own people? In the 9th century, Ghana had a standing army of 240,000 troops, one of the largest armies in the whole world of that day. No outside help. There was no army in Europe that big at that time. 40,000 archers moving high. The king around 1000 was Tennessee. Now, Tennessee is not known for very much, except he had a habit of inviting thousands of people for dinner. He would announce in the morning that he'd like to have about 10,000 people for midday meal. And by midday, 1,000 people showed up and the food was ready. Now, this item wouldn't be worth much except If without warning a king announced that he wanted 10,000 people for midday meal and the meal is ready, that showed remarkable court organization. You had an army of people fixing food. Cattle had to be killed. Fires had to be lit. People, whole rolls of meat had to be put on spigot and turned until it got done. Then they had to put it on platters and cut it and serve it. And I mean, the table, the kitchen was as organized as an army. You can't say that's primitive. That's civilized eating, civilized organization too. In the meantime, the women were organizing themselves into an organization of great consequence. Then you have to look at the social order. But when you look at the social order of Africa itself, the things that white women are debating about now, Africans never debated about. You didn't debate about whether a woman was equal. Equal? Nobody was fool enough to debate whether a mother was equal to a giver of life. You're going to debate whether she's equal? That's stupid. You don't even bring up a stupid conversation like that. You debate whether your mother, your grandmother, is your equal? A Western man will debate something like that. Africa don't debate nothing like that. This is why the Africans had female gods earlier. You make a woman a god, you make a woman a god, didn't debate whether she's equal. You sell the question as whether she's equal when you make her a god. And Africans had gods, but Europeans had shoes or houses with windows. See, what you have to understand, Africans created a system of spirituality, but the Europeans created a system of religion with no spirituality. They still do it. Do you think Jimmy Swaggart and Billy Graham got any spirituality? These are millionaire hustlers. Do you think they believe that? You know, on rock, these people are millionaires. A true spiritual man wouldn't even be a millionaire. If he gave to the people he's supposed to, he wouldn't have $1 million left. If he served people where he's supposed to serve, he wouldn't have $1 million left. Now let's see, because in Africa the king was a priest king, and he was a distributor of goods and service. He was a keeper of wealth, not an owner of wealth. The main thing is, after Tennessee, that greatest king came to power, Ten Kamini, known as the king who rode out twice a day, every day. He would ride out among his people and administer justice. He would hold court wherever people thought an injustice had been done. And no one was obliged to move from his presence until that person was satisfied that justice in his case had been done. And the king was obliged to stay there until that person was satisfied. And the lowliest person could petition the king in his case. If he thought he had a case, the lowliest person could petition the king. This was democracy even to excess. This was the royal monarchy. You see, what you have to understand, Africans didn't preach about democracy. They just gave it. They never used the word. They just administered. See, in the second time, he was dressed in royal regalia, dogs with gold collars, and men walking behind the horse. These were the men of the mat. Just in case the horse gets a little tired, these mats were silk and brocade. And the horse get a little tired, all the men had to do is to lay down the mat so the horse can rest. The king were better dressed than the horses were better dressed than the kings of Europe. Splendor. They said he had men with gold, with clumps of gold so large. They had a loop in the gold. When they want to steady the horse, they put down the gold and put the loop under the gold. The horse could stay there till he tend to business. There was so much gold that all the big hunks of gold were brought to the king. People could keep the little pieces. They had no commercial use for some of the gold. There was so much of it. See, that's why people came and envied our gold. This is what I keep repeating, that we have always been the world's richest people, rich in culture, rich in material, and rich in spirit. This is why we didn't build no great churches and cathedrals. We didn't have to build churches and cathedrals. All life was our cathedral. We celebrated everything, and we respected life so much, we didn't even step on a cockroach. All living things are part of the celebration of life. A tree was part of our holiness. So we created spirituality. And the spirituality began to challenge when other people came along and created religion and began to commercialize on it. And what we have to get back, and what has saved us as a people, is our spirituality. See, when people created religions, they put it in a container. And they put some restrictive rules around it, but we were obeying these rules all along. We never said, I'm my brother's keeper. We just kept him. We didn't say that, brother's died, I got to make sure that his wife was dead. We just did it. And it wasn't a Sunday go to meeting thing. It was an all-day thing. And see, it was the spirituality of this of that society that maintained it, but maintained it all of the time. And this is what the foreigners didn't understand. And this is what Islam did not understand then and does not understand now. And this is what the misconception of Christianity of that time did not understand then and does not understand now. And this is what we have to get back. This is what we must infuse in other things. All right, now, my main point here is that during the period of 10 Committee, this is its high point of achievement as a great nation state controlling the trade routes to the north, controlling the gold trade from the north to the south. It was during this time that Islam, that had conquered the kingdom of the Susus, now Mauritania, began to envy this state that they could not convert to Islam. Failing to convert it to Islam, they decided to destroy it. Finally, the royal house of the Limtunu decided to mount an invasion of Ghana. This invasion happened 1076. When Abu Bakr led this invasion, it was a success. He occupied Ghana for 10 years. Then his co-religionists got in trouble. Already, a bunch of religious fanatics called the Almoravids, created by another religious fanatic, Yusuf bin Tishfan, had joined the group in Spain, and that group, now in trouble, called for help. When Abu Bakr tried to pull the army out of Ghana to help the co-religionists in Spain, Abu Bakr died. Ghana regained her independence, but did not regain her strength. It would never be the same again. So therefore, Ghana, stripped of its ancient glory, continued to exist, but its strength is gone. Its great king, Tenkaminin, is dead, and the Susus began to prey on a neighboring state called Mali. When they invaded the neighboring state under a general called Samanguru, they killed all the members of the royal family except a crippled boy, Sundiata Kita, whose royal name was Mario Jetta. This crippled boy grew up brooding over the loss of his family and swearing that one day he will avenge the wrong done to his family. The Susus thought that he would not amount to anything and that they could make a puppet out of him. They were wrong. He grew up to be very strong and to challenge them, and one day he was called the Lion Prince. The important thing about Sundiata, the important thing about the African doctors of that day, that this boy, born crippled, was cured by African doctors, grew up strong and healthy, and drove the Susus from his country, consolidated his country, and took over all of the land area that once was Ghana. Now you see the consolidation of a large land area, that you see what used to be Ghana becoming part of Mali, and this land area is going to be consolidated later into Sangay. Now, the history of Mali can be told through three men: Sundiata Keita, the usurper Sakuru. Sundiata came to power around 1250 AD. After he built the state, consolidated the state, and may well be its greatest emperor. After Sundiata, about 1250 to about 1265, now the state gets its first purely Muslim leader. Former servant in the court who seized power, called the usurper. His name, Sakuru. Sakuru goes on the trip to Mecca and Medina, and he decided to come through the southern route down the Red Sea to what is now Djibouti and Jigjiga, to what used to be Italian Somaliland, or French Somaliland. He meets the people who are no-nonsense people. They might be savage in the Hollywood sense, or might not. They're no-nonsense people. People called the Danakios. They are the meanest people in Africa. They're the Turks of Africa. They're people who don't want any friends, don't want to be anybody's friend, and don't want anybody to be their friends. Tell everybody to drop dead, and they'll drop you dead if you mess with them. Drove de Gaulle was went in that area telling them to stay in the French open. Tell them to get the hell out. People start throwing rocks at de Gaulle. Get out of here. Anyway, when Socorro came into that area, they were the only people who would rob a caravan. They took his gold, anything valuable he had, and they killed him. And what else happened? They embalmed him and sent a runner all the way back to his home to let them know that he's dead. Then something else happened that I can explain chemically. They embalmed his body in honey. And when he arrived home, that's about 4,000 miles away, he looked lifelike. And all that African sun must have taken 2 months to get him back. How he could look lifelike with all that, the honey is sugar. I don't know how you explain this chemically. I guess some chemists will have to explain it to me. How he could look lifelike, I don't know. But every story I read said that he looked lifelike when he arrived. Then they gave him a big state funeral. But he was the second king in Mali. And he would open the way for the greatest of the most colorful, but not necessarily the greatest. I think Sundiata was still the greatest king. He would open the way for the most colorful of all the kings of Mali, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa came to power 1306. Now he would come to power and prepare for a great journey. He would dig special gold, make preparations for this great journey. He spent from 1302, 06. He would not go on the journey until 1324. All that time he's preparing for this journey to Mecca and Medina. He's a great Muslim, devout. When the journey starts, it will be one of the most magnificent journeys in the history of the world. He would take from 60 to 100,000 people. He would take 50 royal hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives. If he got 50 hairdressers just for his favorite wives, so how many wives? You guess. He would have 500 men march in front of his entourage with staffs of pure gold. 250 camels, 250 pounds of gold each. Men would travel 2 weeks ahead of his entourage, letting people know that the king of the gold country is on its way, and there'll be presents for everyone. He would marry 50 people of his group into all the countries through which he would travel. Then he would say on his way back, we shouldn't be fighting each other because we are relatives. It was a great peace mission too. He would build, if you arrive on Friday, he would build swimming pools for people to have pleasure on the journey when he stopped. This trip is well described by his own writers and others. One of the great journeys in the history. Mansa Musa's famous journey to Mecca and Medina. When he arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians thought he was so magnificent. One Egyptian chronicler said, "He is Africa, there is nothing else." For 300 years, they were singing the praise of the great king of the gold country. He crosses over to Mecca and Medina, had trees built, planted in his honor. He gave away lavishly alms to the poor, and he wanted to have a second well built at the well of Zamzam, where the prophet saw the mission. They told him that this wasn't exactly orthodox. So he thought with all the people going on the Hajj, pay respect to the Prophet Muhammad, that there wasn't enough water in the well. Well, now, with all the people going in the Hajj, they found some electrical way of sneaking some more water in the Hajj. After all, it's been a long time since the Prophet saw the mission and had drink water at the well, so maybe there's not enough water in there right now. Desert country. On his way back, he was proclaimed, or anyway, the intention was to proclaim him as Grand Caliph of the Western Sudan, really the chief minister of Islam in the whole of the Western Sudan. But he was supposed to bow down and kiss the feet of the Grand Caliph of Egypt. He thought this ill became head of state of his caliber, and he declined the honor. They changed the rules just for him. He was still proclaimed the Grand Caliph of the Western Sudan. He was a little short of cash, having given away money so lavishly. So they made the whole treasure of Egypt available to him. Take what you want. The king of the gold country is good for it. So he took enough cash to see his way home and took 2 architects with him. These architects were to redesign some of the buildings in his country. Now, this is no ordinary man, so no ordinary homecoming present is good for him. While he's away, his soldiers conquered the neighboring country and gave him an entire country as a homecoming present. They gave him the country of Sangay. Gave him the neighboring country, Sangay, as a homecoming present. He goes to Timbuktu, and as security, he takes 2 royal princes, Alec Alone and Solomon Nap. You're not going to hear very much from Solomon Nap. They're twins, but Alec Alone is considered to be the oldest because he had the first bath after birth. That's an African custom. The old ladies gather around the twins, irrespective of who emerges from the womb the first. The old ladies look and look and look and say who they think is going to be the wisest. And they give that one the first bath. And that's the one that becomes, they lavish the greatest praise on. And that's the one that's considered the oldest. In general, that's the way it generally works out. So these 2 royal princes goes to Mali. See now, look at the wisdom of it. Instead of declaring war and killing a whole lot of people, Africans just take 2 hostages and let the king know that if you start any stuff here, now I got two of your children in my house. And so if you don't want any harm to come to them, now you just behave yourself. Isn't that better than killing a whole lot of people? Well, that's the way Africans do it. There's a humanity even in war. So he takes these two royal hostages, takes them back to Mali. But he gives them a little too much freedom. And after the death of Mansa Musa, they have a tendency to ride out alone. And they ride closer and closer to the border of that country until they finally get the message across to that country, Sangay, that the other colonies are breaking away from Mali now that Mansa Musa is dead. And that it is time for Sangay to make a move. When finally they escape during the reign of the king that succeeds Mansa Musa, Mansa Morgan, Ali Colon comes across the border and he is proclaimed Soni, meaning liberator. And he becomes the first of the two kings to bear the name Soni Ali. And the country's great fame, Sangay, rises to fame under Soni Ali the first and Soni Ali the second. Now you're beginning to see the formation of the largest and the greatest of the great African kingdoms before the slave trade. This is the kingdom that is going to go to great height. And Soni Ali II and his successor, Askia the Great, Muhammad bin Abdullah Hassan, is going to be Muhammad Ahmad, is going to be two of the greatest Muhammad Ituri is going to be two of the greatest Africans born in the last 2,000 years. And they will take this nation to Africa's great walk in the sun. And this would be the greatest performance of Africans in ruling the state since the decline of Egypt. What we will examine in the next session is the last of these great states, Sangay, the last great state before the slave trade. And I will show that this state equal and was far superior to the European states of its day and was far superior to some of the European states of this day. And it is a pity that you don't know about it. It's a greater pity that our children do not know about it. We have to go back into our history and learn this. And the main thing that has been directed against us that makes us feel so depressed is that we have been robbed of the concept of self-confidence and historical memory. And once we understand what we have done, we will understand what we still have to do. And that self-confidence and historical memory is what we need to reclaim again, not just for ourselves, but for our children. Because once we understand where we have been, we understand where we are. But most important, we will understand what we still must be and where we still must go. Thank you.
All right, brothers and sisters, we want to thank Dr. Clarke one more time. Let's give him another round of applause. We're going to let him catch his breath and take a little breather. And we're going to give you the opportunity
that might have been almost equal amount could have died.
Yeah, no, a few years ago, when there was some figures that you was giving, I was told, and I find it very devastating because matter of fact, I've never heard of Goree Island before. And this is why for the past 2 weeks I've been talking to you. I am taking 35 children. We've been raising money for 2.5 years for that reason, so that they can be exposed to that. Because I am 40 years old and never heard of Goree Island.
Goree Island is the French clearinghouse for slavery, and it's off the coast of Senegal.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a tourist attraction. And I was there twice this summer.
But I find it a devastating experience. It was a devastating experience for me.
Well, if you think that's a devastating experience, you wait till you go to Elmina in Ghana, which is the largest and the most gruesome of the slave force. One lady collapsed at Goree. I said, if you collapse at Goree, when you get to Ghana, I don't know what you're going to do. I advise you not to even go to Ghana. Because the worst one's in Ghana.
Dr. Clarke, as we look through history, we see that Africans seem to be made the most prevalent peoples of slavery. The Arabs, the Indians took African slaves. What was it that made Africans accessible to slavery, or in their nature? I mean, was it anything in their nature, or was it something in the way the villages were organized that they couldn't protect themselves from being captured and taken in such large numbers to various parts of the world? China even took African slaves. Why didn't they take Chinese? Why weren't other peoples taken? Or were they?
Well, there's a naivete in our nature as a people that's still there. We're still basically an unprotected people. We still act as though we don't need protection. We still have not recognized the meanness in other people to the extent that it exists. And until we do, we will continue to be in existence. There isn't, I doubt if there's 50 good fighter pilots in all Africa. A whole continent. Well, that's not a good answer. In ancient Africa, they acted as though they didn't need protection. In the first African invasion, a bunch of sheep herders from Western Asia came in and took over Egypt. They were called the Shepherd Kings. We've always been misguided about other people's intentions. We still are. We misguided about what other people say they mean. We still are. It's bigger than that. And that's a good question. There's a lot of people in the world. Why us? There were more people in Asia. Why not them? When Christopher Columbus set out, he had instructions to go to Asia, the land of the Kublai Khans. Why did he come to the West Indies? Why did he double-cross Isabella? And he did. he recommended, was upon Christopher Columbus' recommendations, that the slave trade was increased. And when he destroyed the Indians, he said, go get the Africans and replace them. Why not go get the Chinese or somebody else? Why the Africans? This won't change until we change it. We have a naive concept toward ourselves, a naive concept toward the world. And we have to change it. We have to stop buying other people's discarded junk and other people's discarded isms. Breaks my heart to say it, but we're partly to blame. I was lecturing earlier today to federal workers, and I said that one thing that we need to begin to think about seriously is the essential selfishness of survival. Think of ourselves first and foremost, and everything else have to come after that. We haven't made up our mind that that's what we have to do. Everybody else will do it. That's not a good answer either, but I don't have one that I believe you'll listen to.
Okay. Dr. Clarke, can you give us that word that has the meaning of alabaster that John Hope confused?
It's loose, loco, luso, loco. It means transparent.
Transparent.
And it was interpreted as it really means something white.
Mm-hmm.
And in ancient times, it was interpreted when they called the people local Ethiopians. He interpreted it mean white Ethiopians, and a lot of people think the Ethiopians belong to the white race. And he said that ancient Ghana was ruled by white kings, and it was a misinterpretation of what they meant, when actually ancient Ghana was ruled for 300 years by the Musi people from the Volta River.
So the Musis were actually these foreign Ethiopians that.
Yeah, I mean, the word Ethiopia used to mean all Africa.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That means foreign Africans who came from another part of Africa.
Okay. I just have one question from last week. You mentioned that Islam instituted the system of patriarchy or patrilineal inheritance, and that caused a lot of confusion. My question is, before these invasions of the Asians and Islamic rule, was Africa all matrilineal?
With the Zulus are exceptional. The Zulus are patrilineal.
Okay, this was before any invasions. They were patrilineal.
The Zulus are patrilineal.
But was the majority of Africa?
The majority of Africans are matrilineal to this day.
Even in West Africa? Before these invasions?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Clarke.
Great.
Through your lectures, I hear you say a specific word in describing African people. So we talk about the monetary riches, talk about the socialisms and the democracy of it, but you keep passing on or speaking about the spirituality of the African, but you don't go into elaborate. Would it be possible for you to speak to us about the spirituality of the African?
Yes, I mean, the spirituality is really what holds the African together. I mean, not the elaborate church, but the spirituality is in the family structure, is in the indigenous religions, is in what they do as against what they say, is in the attitudes. I'm not talking about the Western educated African, the African who comes to the West and play games. I'm talking about the sense of welcome that you get in the villages, and the African who's not a Christian whose attitude toward you is more Christian than that of a Christian.
Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Clarke. I would just like for you to expand on a statement you touched on before about the African being so open and receptive of others, as long as they didn't, interfere with their religion, such as the Arab and the Hebrew who came into Ghana earlier, and they were immediately trying to conspire. Do you think that's happening today in view of the fact that, especially in Black areas here in our city, that we have so many Arab merchants now coming into our areas and whatnot? And then the situation in the Middle East, could that all be tied again? We will see, as you said last week, about the perhaps the Israeli and the Arab laying down in bed together again to conspire against Africa.
I believe it's the same scenario all over again. Unfortunately, I think it's all over again, and I'm suspicious in that regard. I really think that we are people with no friends of consequence in this world, and I don't think we know it. I think marginally we have a few individual friends, and I think we have overestimated even that. But I don't really think we have many friends among the other so-called ethnic groups. But I don't think that we are a minority. I really think, I don't think the Arabs who in our community have any true friendship among us. And I think people will save themselves, and if they have to save themselves at our expense, they will have no compunctions about doing it.
Thank you.
Dr. Clarke, words to say thank you for your very illuminating lecture. As always, it brings one to mind of the great scholars of old, like Confucius and his disciples. One can think of the Christ and his disciples and so forth and so on, just on true knowledge, what I think the Hebrew calls it well, anyhow, it's truth in Hebrew symbols. I'd like to, I was hearing you speak.
Our guest is Dr. JohnHnrik Clarke, professor of African World History at Hunter College. Dr. Clarke spoke at the University of Texas at Austin in November 1973 under the auspices of the university's African and Afro-American Research Institute. Dr. Clarke is introduced by Dr. John Warfield, associate professor and director of the institute.
In the annals of all people, we find certain men and women who've been willing to stand any appreciable distance from the herd in order to speak the truth to their own people and to the world. And they have often done that against great obstacles and great adversity. And we're privileged today on this campus to have with us one of those people who has been willing at times when it was unpopular to speak the truth regarding the civilization of man. And within that effort, to place African people in the proper perspective as we look at that civilization and history. Dr. JohnHnrik Clarke, who is the professor of African World History at Hunter College, has been the associate editor of Freedom Ways quarterly journal, produced to speak to the question of Black people in the world, and just recently including a 3-year distinguished visiting professor at Cornell University. He's been around among the folk, probably one of the most renowned teachers in the country, publishing many books. His most recent one, Slavery and Slave Trade, with Vincent Harding. And we're very much pleased to have him here today. It is at this point I'd like to present to you our colleague, our brother, Dr. JohnHnrik Clarke.
I want to thank Professor Warfield for the invitation. And what I'm going to be talking about is Africa and the New World, new dimensions in African history, which means a new way of looking at Afro-American history. That means that I will be moving very rapidly over a large body of information, the kind of information that you need to devote a whole semester to. I think I'll begin by questioning the title of my lecture. What do you mean by New World? In as much as the new information on the pre-Columbian presence of the African in the New World tends to prove that there were Africans in this side of the world in South America and the West Indies, but particularly in the West Indies and parts of South America as early as 500 BC. And the reading of Christopher Columbus's diary will prove that according to his own accounts, and he was no friend of the blacks, that he found Africans in the New World doing business with Indians and using minted West African coin. And that when many of the Spanish conquistadors, especially those who went to the area that is the Panama Canal, they found small Black colonies with the Indians in South America. And in a work by Walter Van Werthner, dealing with terracotta and sculpture in South and in Central America, he dug up the greatest physical evidence of the presence in the Africans in the New World that has so far been dug up. And in early works of Carter G. Woodson, and in a 3-volume work by Leo Wiener called The African and the Discovery of America, he said, and he pretty much sustained what he said, that the African could have preceded the Indians in this side of the world, and that a lot that you think of as Indian culture is African culture. He got thrown out of Harvard for writing the book. Now, why did this place Christopher Columbus in context with New World discovery? And in as much as he discovered a world full of people, then let us assume that the people that he discovered something. And he discovered both Indians and Africans in this side of the world. In actuality, when we look at this year, 1492, look at its great significance in history. Maybe of all the things that happened in 1492, maybe the least important thing that happened was this bad navigator started out from one side of the world and stumbled up on the other side of the world. Now, it has been proven that the Portuguese had already charted their movement to this side of the world, and they did not confuse the West Indies with the East Indies as Christopher Columbus did most of his life. And one of the main reasons why they did not come ahead of Columbus, because they had it on their charts and they had established priority. They wanted to build those fortresses along the coast of West Africa. They were going to use to hold the slaves while the ships come in. They gave that priority to New World movement. But the Portuguese, who were the master mariners of the day, thanks to the information that filtered into Europe after the Crusades, mostly from China, they had no confusion about what this part of how to get to this part of the world. All right, now, my point is, had Christopher Columbus not come, Europeans were going to come anyway. Now, there is all the talk about, which is beautiful folklore, about the debate between whether the world was round or flat. These were old wise tales told in Europe that had no great significance. Now, as the Europeans came out of the Crusades, began to recover some of their own strength, began to stir from the lethargy of the Middle Ages, they made a decision, and that decision still holds, and that is, whatsoever the world is in shape, round or flat, we are going to take it. And that is what they did. And they decided that whosoever ruled the world is going to be one of us. And this decision, coming at a time when there were internal differences between the African states, and when the pluralistic states in West Africa had not settled their family differences, and when they made the horrible mistake of inviting the first Europeans in to arbitrate family differences, they were in serious trouble because they were making a glaring error, which many African states still made. The African who came to the New World did not yield his African identity. In fact, he began to search for that African identity. And he began in this period of Holocaust and disarray and mixtures of culture. He began to search not only for his identity in this new world, but his identity in the world. And he knew that he had an identity and a history that commanded respect. And when blacks began to produce an intellectual class in the Western world, that intellectual class, both in the West Indies and America, began to address itself to the definition of blacks in world history, began to attempt to locate blacks on the map of human geography. And some of the pioneers in this movement were scholars from the West Indies. Some Afro-Americans gave up the search and adopted the distorted image that was created by the oppressors. But as early as 1881, Edmund Wilmot Blyden, the great West Indian scholar and benefactor of West Africa, addressed himself to this situation when he said, this is 1881 now, this is his inaugural address at the Liberia College. And if you listen to it, you'll find out that this man in 1881 was ahead of most of the black scholars of today. He would go on to have a great career and to write a classic work that would do well to read today called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. He says during this speech, in all English-speaking countries, the mind of the intelligent Negro child revolts against the deceptions and the distortions given in elementary books and geographies and travels and in history. Having embraced or at least ascended to the falsehoods about himself, he concludes that his only hope is to be those things most unlike himself and most alien to his peculiar taste. He goes on to say that one of our great tragedies is that we have spent too much time feeding grist into other people's mills. Then he bemoans, nothing comes out except what has been put in, and that then is our great sorrow. What this man was telling us in 1884 is that we have to reclaim ourselves and our own our own heritage and the nature of our history. He would go on and he would be the teacher of Africans, and he was the mentor of some of the early Black nationalists in Western Africa. And of course, he would write many books. He was the first person to use the word African personality. He wrote a work on African socialism in 1901. He was the first person to champion the unification of Africa during that period, especially West Africa. He entered into a famous debate between Sir Harry Johnson and himself over the religious destiny of Africa, Islam or Christianity. He was of the opinion that Islam would be better for Africa because it was more adaptable to prevailing African ways of life. Then he qualified this, and his qualification need to be looked at today. He said, if the African understood the dynamic qualities of indigenous African religions, he would need neither Christianity or Islam. That's more true today than it was then. Black people have a tendency to get hung up on outside inputs. Now, I am not conceding Islam to the Arabs, and I am not conceding Christianity to white people. I know that we nurse both of these religions in that cradle, and we played a major role in bringing not only this religion into being, but all known religions into being. Because the first salvation-oriented religions the world can trace came out of Africa. And all religions are salvation-oriented. So therefore, the very idea, the very germ, the very genesis of world religions came out of Africa. No, I am not conceding Islam to the Arabs. I am conceding the Arabs' interpretation to him. I am conceding the Europeans' interpretation to Christianity to the European. Because once the European took over this religion for political reasons and began to use it as a political instrument and almost as a framework of his nationalism, Christianity died and Christendom was born. And there's a difference between Christianity and Christendom. Christendom is a political weapon. Christianity is a religious way of life. And for Christendom to come into being and to kill Christianity, then Christendom had to violate every rule that governs Christianity. Had to justify the slave trade, had to justify the monstrosity of the colonial system. It had to justify the demeaning of people. It had to rewrite the history of the world, glorifying Europe at the expense of other people. This is Christendom. And Christendom is forming a task that is anti-Christianity. Now, when this baby called Christianity left its cradle in North Africa and in the Middle East and went over to Europe and was used for political reasons, it was no longer our baby. And when they bring him home and sell him to us, they're selling us something which is alien in its present interpretation to our context. Because if they understood, and this is what Blyden was trying to get across, when you understand indigenous African religions and the binding nature of that religion, you will understand that these religions are basically Christian religions, and that there is nothing in Christianity, in moral law, that isn't already in those indigenous African religions. They never say that I am my brother's keeper, but they keep their brother. They don't preach about it, but they do it. If a young brother dies and he has a wife and children, the older brother takes care. He don't cry about it, gets a little help, but he automatically takes over. It's part of the law that governs the whole society. No homes for the aged because nobody discards their mother. No homes for the abandoned children because nobody abandons children. And up until recently, no insane asylums because nobody went insane. because the protective mechanism was built into the society itself. Now, with the coming of the Europeans to West Africa, with the misunderstanding of the Christian elements of indigenous African religions, and with imposing Christendom on Africa in violation of Christianity, African societies would suffer. But now we're going to have to look back now at the genesis of the blacks in the New World. And that genesis has to deal with looking at the rise of Europe and the consequences of history involved in that rise. You're going to have to look at what I have been referring to as Europe's evil genius. And that evil genius of Europe began to develop after the Crusade period. The European had developed certain basic technology, principally the gun, not to kill any African or Asian, but to protect himself from himself, but to protect themselves from each other. And the weaponry that the European had developed in Europe to protect himself from other Europeans, once that family dispute was partly settled, that weaponry was used to expand into the broader world. And the Christian story, which he did not buy for himself, about meekness and turning the other cheek, he would go out now and sell it to certain people naive enough to buy it, because the same elements were embedded into his indigenous way of life. And something fell apart. Certain things were misread in history. Now let's look at the consequences of that rise, because this is what would bring the African to the New World. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, fortunately for Europe, unfortunately for Africa, when Europe began to shake off the power and the hold of African domination of the Mediterranean, and I'm using my words well, because that domination of Spain that the Arabs take so much credit for was military African from the beginning. The original conquest of Spain was an African conquest, and a black African conquest at that. And Haile Bourguiba's work called Tariq Ben Zayed, named after the black general from Mauritania and Senegal who went up to Morocco and organized the force that conquered Spain. In this eyewitness account, he says, the army was as black as ink. The general was blacker still. This would establish African military control. Now, the Arabs did not come into Spain in large numbers until much later. And the Arabs were never in complete control in Spain. The Africans came in at a time, literally, and rescued the Jewish population from the persecution by the Visigoths, and formed a partnership between the Africans and the Jews that lasted throughout the whole of this period, and helped to give the Jews their second golden age in Spain. But there's so many partnerships that we have entered into with other people that they have forgotten. They have forgotten. I attended a conference 2 years ago to deliver a paper on the myth of black anti-Semitism, and another person delivered a paper on the genesis of black anti-Semitism. What the hell are you talking about? There is no genesis. Because there is no historical record of dissension between blacks and Jews. And the present day dissension is strictly 20th century and strictly urban. And urban within the last 20 years at that. I'm not going to get too further into this because I got too many other things to do. But my point is that with the decline of Europe, with the decline of Rome, and Europe going into the Middle Ages, saw the rise of Islam in the African military arm of Islam becoming predominant in the Mediterranean, especially in Spain. Now, in the 1450s, this period was over. And fortunately for Europe and unfortunately for Africa, some of the maps that the Jewish gold dealers had used to go down into the west of Sudan and along the coast of West Africa fell into the hands of a man called Henry the Navigator. Now, there's no proof that Henry ever went to sea, but the one thing he did which helped Europe in its expansion was to start schools to train people in navigational sciences. But most of the information in navigational science and marine engineering came out of the advanced technology then coming out of China. And it was with this technology Europe used to unlock itself. Now, one of the main reasons why most of the maps were made by Jewish gold dealers, it is because some of the Jews in Spain had come from North Africa and they could handle Indo-African languages. And their relationship with the people in Inner Africa was very good and had been very good for years. Even the years after the dispute the Jews had with Rome, they went down and lived for 400 years. A whole Jewish colony lived in ancient Ghana. Now, this is totally left out of Jewish history, as though it didn't even happen at all. But a Father Williams, who's a little overly partial in the subject, has written a book called Hebrewisms of West Africa. Now, Father Williams tried to prove that everything in West Africa is Jewish. Everything. And more so to the point that after Ghana became independent, some Ghanaian students wanted to impress white people, said that, now, I must tell you that we are one of the lost tribes of Israel. I got tired of the nonsense. I said, look, they only lost 12 tribes, now 30 shows up. Now, some of you people didn't get lost. But if you really want to know the history of the Jewish population in North Africa to the nations in Inner Africa, I mean, there is information on that. But now, the 1400s were bad times for Africa because these were the times that Europe had learned the technique of expansion and had made the kind of boats it needed to take the roar of that mighty ocean and to go on long-range trips. Now, using some of these maps, the Portuguese at first would come down the west coast of Africa. And they would come down the west coast of Africa, not looking for slaves at first, but hearing the legends about the great gold of Africa. Their first trip was to look for gold, look for allies. They had heard about Prester John. And they were looking for Prester John. They were looking on the wrong side of Africa anyway. And besides, he was dead 300 years when they got there. But they'd heard about Sonny Alley. They misspelled his name, but they'd heard about it. They'd heard about Mansa Musa and the famous journey to Mecca and Medina. This man in 1324 went on a journey out of Africa across, being a devout Muslim, to pay his respects, taking with him 280 camels, each with 250 pounds of gold. 500 men marching in front of his entourage with staffs of pure gold. 50 royal hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives. From 60 to 100,000 people moving across Africa. He married so many of his people into the countries through which he traveled. And on his way home, he said, we shouldn't fight each other now because we are relatives. When he arrived in Egypt, El Amari, a historian, made an account of it. They say, he is Africa, there is nothing else. And though he was a devout Muslim, the Grand Caliph of Islam was in Egypt and asked to see him, to see this man, the great gold king from West Africa. We ain't talking about no savages. Ain't no savage had nothing like this. No organized state, empire, almost as large as the land territory of the United States, with governors and viceroys. Europe was wallowing in its Middle Ages then. European kings didn't even have good shoes when this was happening. And the mats for his horses were made out of better material than European kings were wearing at the time. Same time. This is an age of grandeur in Africa. No savagery. The savage was an invention. And this man decided that he would see the Grand Caliph, but he let him know that he was the equal of any man in Islam. And the general custom when you meet the head of the Muslim faith is to remove his shoes and kiss his feet and remove your shoes, but he don't kiss yours. And he said, no time. We'll meet as equals or we will not meet at all. And he was as devout a Muslim as ever. The main thing that this man did was that he went back, taking an architect named Ibn Asad, and he rebuilt the Western Sudan, the countries that enter West Africa, Timbuktu in the lot. And he opened a great university called Sankore at Timbuktu. Now, it seems very odd for you to understand this because white historians said there was no higher learning in Africa, nothing. But there were 4 universities in Timbuktu as late as 1594 when the Moroccans destroyed. 4 universities. And Timbuktu was not the leading university city in Western Africa. It was the city of Dijon. Now, the African was in serious trouble and did not know he was in serious trouble. And the year 1492 helped to set that serious trouble in motion. Now, I have alluded to the New World discovery and Christopher Columbus's accidental ending up navigational error that put him on one side of the world instead of the other. I'm sorry he didn't get to the East Indies. These people were more sophisticated in the East Indies, and he would never have seen home again. Had he pulled the stuff in the East Indies that he pulled on the Indians in the West Indies, they would have watched him. That'd have been the end of that. And I'm sorry about the navigational error. He should have gotten to the East Indies. But Columbus set in motion the genocide that destroyed the entire Indian population of the Caribbean islands to the last man, woman, and child. There is probably not a human being alive who can say he's even a distant relative of one of those Indians. They were totally wiped out. And Christopher Columbus set this in motion. Now, let's go back to 1492 again. 1492 in Spain, the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand had unified certain warring factions of the church. And this unity gave Spain the strength to expel the Moors from Spain. Many of these Moors coming back into Africa, soreheads, began to prey on other parts of Africa. Their expulsion created an internal dispute in Africa. North Africans preying on the people in inner Western Africa. 1492 again in Africa. One of the great African militarists who ever lived, Sonny Ali, then emperor of the empire of Songhai, died on his way, was drowned on his way from a minor war in the south. And the empire suffered for a year, but later on, 1493, a man came to power who would take inner Western Africa to the apex of its golden age, right in the middle of the slave trade and in spite of the slave trade. His name was Muhammad Abubakar Ituri. Secretary is a direct descendant of this same man. He had been prime minister of the country and head of the army for 30 years. He ruled the country as an emperor for 36 years. My point is that the coming of the Europeans to the coast of Africa did not mean the total collapse of African nations. These nations would not begin to collapse in inner Africa until the Moroccan invasion, one of the tragic incidents in Africa. The Moroccan invasion of inner Western Africa using partly white mercenaries. And when we began to look at African history comparatively as events of disaster in Africa, the invasion of the Western Sudan, the destruction of the city of Timbuktu, Guinea, and Goye, the exiling of the great scholars from the university at Saint-Corrie, but the destruction of the city itself is tantamount to the Roman destruction of Carthage. The second worst disaster in the history of Africa. Now, when all of this happened, the nations in inner Africa collapsed and could not come to the defense of the nations along the coast. Now the slave trade could move to the hinterlands just at the time the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English were fighting over territory in the so-called New World, and the Portuguese, thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas, had the big colony of Brazil and had to scramble to increase their slave trade in order to populate this big colony, which was over and beyond anything the Portuguese could do justice to. My point is that in this new world, these Africans began a revolt. They began to revolt on the boat coming over. They continued the revolt to keep from getting off of the boat. And they continued the revolt after they got off of the revolt. And the one thing which would facilitate the revolts of the African in South America and in the West Indies was African cultural continuity. Once you look at these revolts, you will find that you had the most successful revolts where you had the largest amount of newly arrived Africans who had not been adjusted to the plantation system. And once you look at these revolts in context with all of South America and the West Indies, you will find a pattern of revolt in the West Indies and in South America, much different from the pattern of revolts in the United States, where you have to take the buying habits of the slave master into consideration. In the United States, the crude, uncultured people, this douce mixture of the human waste matter of Europe. I have said once, and both my students and especially the white professor said that, no, that's too much exaggeration for shock treatment. I wasn't exaggerating for shock treatment. I was saying that Europe literally dumped its human garbage can into the area called the United States. And that you had bad seed from the beginning because Europe's discards in the main populated this part of the United States. A few different types in New England, but not that different, not that different. Malcontents. Now, in their buying of slaves, they generally bought in small lots and resold a lot. Now you see mama going one way, papa going one way. You see the cultural continuity broken. And when you break a people's cultural continuity, you break their loyalty system. And it is the loyalty system and the institution that produced loyalty system that holds the people together. While in the West Indies and South America, they bought in large lots and kept them together because they thought they could exploit them better that way. They were right. But the one thing they forgot is that they could revolt better that way. And so the nature of revolt in the Caribbeans and in the Western and in South America was distinctly different. And besides, an island is a capsule. You're pent up there on this island. And culture can be contained better on an island than in places where you have so much land mass to dissipate people physically, and to also dissipate their culture. And besides, by buying in large lots, most of the slaves in the Caribbean came from the same general area within Africa and could speak the same basic African language and could maintain the drum language, which was the key to the success of the Haitian Revolution. Now, in the 1660s, these revolts began to develop in Jamaica, especially in Jamaica, not in Haiti right now, the revolts in Cuba in the 1500s, as early as 1522, a slave revolt in Cuba. Now, what you need to understand about the blacks in the New World and the relationship of these blacks to the rest of the history of the New World, that there were continuous revolts. Now, there were revolts of blacks who had been converted to Islam in Africa. There were revolts of African traditional kings whose authority extended to their presence in the New World. And it was nip and tuck, and they could barely make it. One of the little known revolts, and I think properly assessed may turn out to be one of the better ones, is the Babis revolt in Guyana, led by a man named Cuffy. And this revolt would come after the famous Maroon revolt in Jamaica, led by a man named Kojo. Both of these are Ghanaian names. Toussaint Louverture came from a place in Ghana called Kamete. Is it accidental that the most successful revolts in the New World were led by slaves from Ghana? Now, look at Ghana today, and look at Ghana at the period of the slave trade. That cultural continuity was more or less intact in Ghana when they were taken. And when they came to the New World, they came out of a tradition of revolt, and they could transfer this condition of revolt to this new setting in the New World. Now, in South America and in the West Indies, especially in South America and Brazil, where there were large numbers of black women married to Portuguese men, but these women maintained their loyalty to the people in the field. Now, why is it that in the West Indies and in South America, nearly every slave revolt was engineered by house servants, and nearly every slave revolt in the United States was betrayed by house servants? Now, if you got your West Indian nationalism or your negative Afro-American feeling up, you have immediately arrived at the wrong conclusion. Both of us were victims of a historical experience over which we had no control. Fortunately for the West Indies, they didn't break him up enough to destroy his loyalty systems. Now, there are exceptions. There are numbers of revolts in the West Indies betrayed by house servants, but generally, the house servant was the motivator of the revolt. One of the classical cases was the revolt in the Danish West Indies, finally led by a black woman who called herself Queen Mary. She was the mistress of the governor. And the rebels told her that at a certain time, they were going to invade the house, cut the governor's throat, and burn the house down over his head. And she said, "What kind of loyal African do you take me to be? You are telling me just to get out of the house. I am for the revolution, and I understand what I will have to lose." She would have to lose her carriage, which she had, those long, beautiful white dresses imported from Europe that she had, and that set of umbrellas that she had with somebody to carry them over her head. She said, inasmuch as I have to leave the house at a certain time, why would you send a man all the way to the house to cut the governor's throat? I would do that before I leave. Now, in spite of the luxury that she had being the mistress of the governor, She had no illusion where her loyalty had to be when the deal went down. And she knew that it was time now for the deal to go down. Now, the same thing happened in Brazil among the black women married to Portuguese men, only they maneuvered in a different way, always marrying off one of her relatives to a Portuguese man newly arrived in the colony, and making these women swear that they would marry unless marriage meant automatic freedom. And when the Portuguese decided to push into the hinterlands of Brazil, these women convinced the Portuguese that you have no armies up there to protect you or to hold any slaves intact. We might as well free some men to go up and do this labor and pay them some decent salaries. These women laid the foundation for the civilization of Brazil. Some of the first families in the New World were families born from the cohabitation of the slave master and these African women. My main point here is that these African women never lost their sense of commitment to African people. And one of the main reasons why they did not lose their sense of commitment to African people is the fact that their cultural continuity had not been broken. Now, in the 1780s, some of this kind of feeling and spirit began to develop in the United States once the blacks, especially in New England, where you had a large number of black craftsmen who freed themselves by virtue of their craftsmanship. They could create a kind of money over and above that was due their master and buy their own freedom. These black craftsmen, having learned how to read, became conscious of that people's plight and began to develop newspapers, magazines, and journals, and became a part of the abolitionist movement. Once they developed newspapers and journals, they began once more to search for their definition. Then in 1829, a black man who ran a secondhand store named David Walker began to look at the situation and make an assessment of what black people had to do, and issued his famous appeal to the colored people of the world. This appeal was the first theoretical basis of what you call Pan-Africanism, and it was the first call for genuine, raw, unmitigated black power. It was the first rejection of the concept that any people could free themselves without violence. And it was rejection of the imagery and the concept that was laid down for black people. Douglass had some serious questions about it, but out of this spirit and out of this period, a number of journals would be developed. Freedom's Journal, North Star, Douglass's newspaper, and a brilliant Jamaican that a lot of Jamaicans don't know was a Jamaican, John B. Russwam, one of the early black college graduates, would edit Freedom's Journal. He would join the colonization movement in spite of his questions about it. And he would go later to Liberia as governor of one of the colonies. The African awareness now was running rampant among black Americans. Martin Delaney would go out to what is now Nigeria with another Jamaican, Robert Campbell, author of an excellent work called Pilgrimage to My Motherland. My point here is that Caribbean Americans coming to the United States at the time did not see their plight as different from that of black Americans. Prince Hall from Barbados had found the Masons, the black Masons. Peter Ogden from Antigua had found the black Odd Fellows and was beginning to use these large oriented organizations as form of protest movements. This was the beginning of the formalization of the black intellectual freedom movement. And during this period, we produced some of the most responsible intellects this country's ever known, and also produced a radical class who excelled any other radicals in the country. But the search for African definition would continue after the Civil War, and it would be reflected in the works of Bishop Turner, a Ghanaian named Chief Sam, who promised to take all Black Americans back to Africa. These are the 1880s now. Bishop Turner would last until 1915, when he died, the same year Booker Washington died. Near the end of the century, the whites grew tired of dealing with multiplicities of Black leaders, and then they decided that they would create a leader. And after the creation of this leader, the first anointed Black leader in America, created by white editorial writers, and white editorial writers have been creating nearly every Black leader since then, and those they do not create, they eventually either kill, drive into exile, or drive to suicide. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there was a man who had made a great impression on white people. His name was Booker T. Washington, and we need to look at Booker T. Washington and look at him anew. And if you call him an Uncle Tom, you've never been so wrong in your life. It's bigger than that. And in his Atlanta Compromise speech, when you look at the historical background which led him to this speech in 1895, the speech was all things to all people. One of the most unique speeches ever made in the history of the world. And you should read it, almost read it yearly, analyze it. What in the hell was he talking about? There was something in it for the South, telling the South you need not worry. Something in it for Blacks, telling the Blacks you got good white people here who take care of you, look after you, be skilled artisans. Something in it for the Northerner who owned the South then and now, telling him that there is peaceful labor here in the South who will not start strikes like those immigrant ingrates up north. The tone of the speech was partly anti-foreign. And he knew exactly that it would get across in this setting. He was telling Blacks, he attacked the Black politician, said stump speeching is not what's going to get it for us. Better open a dairy farm. Then came the appeasement that was dear to the hearts of whites. He said, we apologize for our humble contribution to this expedition. A little pumpkins here and there, quills, different things that we have done. But the humbleness of our contribution is indicative of our great need. 1895. Now, Booker Washington knew he was telling a lie. He was strategic playing to the feelings of white people. Now, what had happened in Black America 1895? The Black inventor had already revolutionized American industry. Lewis Latimer had assisted in the development of the electric light, had written a book, a textbook on the incandescent light, had drawn up the model for the telephone, because Alexander Graham Bell could not even get a pattern until somebody draw all of its moving parts, and he could not draw all of its moving parts, and this Black man was to do that for him. This had already been done in 1895 now. He had done many things, including one thing I'm not too proud of. He had improved the old Gatling gun, forerunner of the machine gun. Elijah McCoy had already revolutionized the lubrication system on the railroads with a drip cup system, which lubricated the railroad in motion. And so many whites stole patterns from Elijah McCoy until anytime a white person go to the pattern office with a lubrication system, the people in the pattern office said, now, is this the real McCoy or something? Did you steal it directly from Elijah McCoy? And that's how the word got into the language. The real McCoy. And whites were stealing patterns from blacks, right and left. Metzelinga had already created the shoe machine, which made the mass manufacture of shoes possible. The third rail had already been developed by a black man. Another black man had created the coupling to hold all of that weight together. In the Old West, the train started coming apart, going down the hill. It was costing a fortune. Now, suppose Booker T. Washington had have told those white people what contribution we had made to industry. Do you think they would have given him millions of dollars, you know, by saying, look, we've done this, now we demand this? The technique would not have gone well in that setting. Now, suppose Booker Washington had to pull that on to you people who have to understand, except for us, you may not have had any industry. They wouldn't have given him a nickel. But playing this humble role and telling his people, you know, that it's better to make $1 a day than to sit next to a white person at the opera, that was exactly what they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear a black leader endorse Jim Crow. Now, he may not have been endorsing any Jim Crow. That may not have been his intent at all. But that was the interpretation that was given to it. And not only did they make him the leader of Black America, they gave him more money than they have ever given any Black American before or since. It was a co-optation of leadership. And I still question whether we paid too high a price for Booker's existence. If a black man wanted a Pullman porter job or even a streetcar job in Cincinnati, all the white people wanted to know is it all right with Booker? And if it wasn't all right with Booker, you did not get the job. And I'm saying that in this atmosphere coming at the end of the 19th, the end of the 20th century, black people began to search anew for their definition in relationship to Africa, in relationship to the world, began to participate in Pan-African conferences, the one in 1900. Then Du Bois began to challenge Booker T. Washington, but the less known challenger of Booker T. Washington, the most adamant challenger of Booker T. Washington was not W.E.B. Du Bois, but a man that we call the Boston Brahmin, William Monroe Trotter. He's the one that disturbed Washington's meeting in Boston and got thrown in jail. He was the one that took exception to Booker T. Washington's stand in the Brownsville raid right here in Texas. A forgotten incident in history. A group of blacks, there are 2 new books on the subject. I don't know if anybody's ignorant. The Brownsville raid was a tragic incident in history. It's been proven later that whites blackened their face and shut up the town in order to get the town excited about driving the blacks out of a local post. Now, when the blacks came to the local post, it was in Huntsville, Texas, Brownsville, Texas, came to the local post, the whites made an assessment of the situation. You've got about 3,000 or 4,000 blacks in the town, and you only got about 36 black families. Men being men, gonna want women. There ain't enough of those, their own kind, so-called, to go around. And maybe they'll entertain other ideas. And maybe we better write the president and get them the hell out of town, in which they did. And when the president, Theodore Roosevelt, did not respond, they took other action. And the whole idea of the Brownsville raid was to build up public sentiment against the presence of large numbers of black troops in Brownsville. Now, when this tragedy occurred, Booker Washington's no comment gave the public the intention that he approved of the persecution of those blacks. But it was Monroe Trotter that challenged him on this. In the meantime, Monroe Trotter and W.B. Du Bois had set in motion the Niagara movement that would later be converted into the NAACP. Other blacks began to reconstruct black history. Booker T. Washington would die in 1915, and W.B. Du Bois would be challenged by the Garvey movement that had more black followers before and since than any other black movement. And it set in motion a search for identity. And this search was reconsidered during the Italian-Ethiopian War. I think all of this search for definition in this part of the country have led us to where we are today, and it's a fitting time, fitting place to conclude the lecture. Where black people are today, standing on a black and beautiful plateau. There's no question about how he got on the plateau, but there's a serious question is how he's gonna get off of the plateau, because he got hung up with a whole lot of illusions that had nothing to do with power. It has something to do with ceremony. And there's nothing basically wrong with ceremony, so long as you also make a ceremony out of being free, a ceremony out of becoming strong. So long as you understand there's nothing principally wrong or overwhelmingly strong in being black and beautiful. And white people are perfectly willing to concede to black people that they are beautiful. In fact, he will make the cosmetics to make you more so. Beauty never hurt anybody. Beauty never destroyed a nation. But if you say you're black and powerful, then you're in trouble. Then you're in trouble, because you're going to change things around. The whole social order will have to adjust to the fact that you are black and powerful. You begin to determine your destiny and the destiny of others. Look at the present thing. Look at today's newspaper. Look at the debates. They are not consulting any one of us. And yet we consist of properly counted. When you consider the fact that there are from 100 to 125 million blacks in the Western world, between the West Indies, Brazil, the United States, and other areas, just in the Western world. They've been counting Africa's population as being 300 million for 50 years, which means that the African man is sleeping away from home, not reproducing himself. Now, you know you're not to take anything like that serious. When they count the millions of blacks in Asia that has not been counted as black, who are definitely African people, New Guinea, New Hebrides Islands, the people so-called Aborigines in Australia, who are still being called niggers, the Doridians in the Middle East, the large black population in Ceylon. When you count all of these people as African people, we are the third, if not the second, largest population on the face of the earth. Africa has the largest amount of untapped resources any place in the world, including oil. Most of the gold of the world comes out of Africa. Most of the hardening process used in gold comes out of Africa. Manganese and the like. Most of the copper in all the world comes out of Africa. Gabon, a little postage stamp country in Africa with less than 1 million people, have the largest bauxite deposit in the world. Africa is the largest geographic reserve in all the world. What made these people think that they're going to make a whole world social order without consulting any one of us? Because you are black and beautiful, and you cannot command the situation or world attention or enter the councils of the world and determine the future of man until you're black and powerful. then you're going to have to use yourself in an entirely different way. You're going to have to stop copping out into the soft sciences and go into the hard sciences, the science of metals, oceanography, the science of shipbuilding, maritime engineering, new systems of automotive engineering, new ways to stretch railroads across the belly of a continent, new ways of making things grow. You in the Western world have the greatest capacity to unlock Africa and make its riches yield for African people than any other African people in the whole world. So you have a mission in the world over and above that of other African people, in as much as you are the largest literate African people, the largest body of literate African people in the whole world. Now what's important now? The bush or the medallion are those science textbooks, or knowing how to make a brickyard and how to manage it, because the world is giving out of wood and they're still going to use houses. All of Africa's bauxite, we might have to build aluminum houses in the future. All of these things has to be figured out, and figured out by you, because if you call your farmer master back to cure your child's stomach ache, he's going to re-enslave you based on your need for him. So let's look at history a different kind of a way, and look at what history can do and what it cannot do. It is not a cure-all. It cannot grow a tomato. It cannot saw wood. It can perform the function that history is supposed to perform. It can tell you your time of day. In the book Tom Tom, the writer JohnHnrik has said, a race is like a man until it uses its own talents, takes pride in its own history, and love its own memories. It can never fulfill itself completely. The role and the importance of ethnic history is how well it teaches a people to use their own talent, take pride in their own history, and love their own memories, in order to fulfill themselves completely in their honorable endeavor. Ethnic history is a clock that people use to tell their time of day. It is a compass that they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells the people where they have been and what they have been. It also tells the people where they are and what they are. Most important, the role of history and the understanding of history is to tell a people where they are and what they still must be. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's creating lecture topics for me faster than I can lecture. The world is changing in our favor, and we don't seem to know it. We're losing some ground and don't know why we are losing it. We're gaining ground and don't know how to consolidate it. And principally because we have gone away from the subject for tonight. We have lost the art and the drive to be an African people. And you cannot be another people and rescue yourself while imitating another people. You have to understand what happened to you as you entered what Professor Van Sertima refers to as the 500-year room. The European, as I have said before, not only began to colonize the world,
He began to colonize information about the world. He began to control images. But the most successful thing he did from his point of view, and the most tragic thing he did from his point of view, he colonized the image of God. And he started you on a tragic journey where so many of us worship everything white, from a white God to white bread. For many of us get a picture fixed in our mind, where we worship white Jesuses over the weekend and plead to a white boss for economic survival the rest of the week, and wonder why we lack respect for our black father, our black lover, our black uncle. If he changed the images around to show himself in power and got people imitating him, then you cannot be your African self, because you've been transformed into someone else's culture container, and you are reacting to being away from the culture that produced you in the first place. And you don't look back enough in Africa to understand that there were no rape cases in Africa, no teenage pregnancy in Africa, no prostitution in Africa, and no Africans worship a God that the Africans did not sanction. The spirit of a people is reflected in their approach to salvation through a deity of their choosing. I am not talking about changing God. I'm talking about changing God concepts, changing approaches. If you go to Japan and look at Buddha, he's Japanese. Indonesia, he's Indonesian. China, he's Chinese. They're all Buddhists. But Buddha looks like the local people in each case. All right, now, let me seem to be talking away from the subject for a few minutes. Let's look at the case in China. Let's look at the case of the Chinese attack on African students, calling them black devils. Then let's look at the case of the Chinese students confronting their own government and demanding democracy without understanding they got more democracy than the people they're imitating. Creating statues of liberty, imitations of the Statue of Liberty, and quoting Abraham Lincoln, who was a racist, assuming that there's some democracy here, without understanding how the nation was fashioned in this country for free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. When they said liberty and justice for all, that was the all. They didn't even mean white women. So if someone's going to turn to America as their inspiration for democracy, they're turning to a bad example. On our way over, Reverend Brown and I were discussing just democracy, and he picked out the case of the Chinese troops. The Chinese troops hadn't shot anybody, and some of them, refused to hurt these kids. That's their cousins and their uncles,
And the nephews, they got some humanity. Over here, they knocked the living hell out of you. A state trooper will take the butt of his gun and make you wish you never been born. And he don't care about you being his cousin. He said, get the hell out of this pocket. You gonna get out of there. He put a bayonet in your behind. They got more democracy in China than they will ever have over here. Now, are these people crazy? Have they read their own literature? Confucius had more to say about democracy and humanity and manhood and womanhood than Thomas Jefferson. Let them go back to their own writers. And when a people lose themselves and become so enthusiastic about things that belong to other people, they become the captives of those other people. And the Chinese are forgetting something. Not too many years ago, there was a foreign settlement in China, in Shanghai. The Chinese couldn't even touch a foreigner. The foreigners had their own police force, their own courts. There were hotels in Shanghai where the only Chinese woman who could go into the hotels, the cleaning woman and a whore. And there were signs on the hotels saying Chinese and dogs not allowed. What in the hell do they think they're talking about? They want American-style democracy. I don't want American-style democracy. I would trade for theirs with all its drawbacks. I would take any kind of democracy if it's honest. And this is the trap we're getting ourselves into. We think we can buy a piece of somebody else's pie. We don't know the cook who baked the pie. And we don't know the pie may be poisoned. Bake your own pie. Design your own government. Look at Africa. There's not a single African government in all Africa, and this is why the African Revolution went wrong. Not a single African government dared to come into being using African methodology, using an African system of government. Going back into African history and seeing the African democratic form. Now let's go back and pick up an example. During the reign in ancient Ghana of a king called Tengamenim, the lowest person in the kingdom could petition his king. He would petition through the council, and the council was duty bound to take his complaint to the king. And if enough people of his status complained about the king, the council had to recommend the abdication of the king. And the king couldn't do about it. Could do nothing about it. This is a monarchy, and yet it was democratic. And this is why Tengamenim was known as the king who rode out twice a day, every day. He would ride out among his people and administer justice. And anybody who wanted to talk to the king could approach the king and did not have to move from his presence until he was sure that justice had been done in his case. He would ride out again in the evening in splendid regalia, dogs with gold collars, horses dressed better than the then kings of Europe, men of the mat, men with silk and brocade mats, just in case the horse want to take a nap, to lay down the mat so the horse can rest a while. Splendor at its best, controlling the gold country, fabulously rich, and the people shared in the riches. The assumption is that a monarchy cannot also be democratic. When we go back and look at these African farms, we don't need to turn to the West for democratic farms. We had these farms. And we had communal living before someone invented communism. We had social living before someone invented socialism. But when it's coming from Europe, because of a European fascination, we think it has to be good because it came from them. We have not looked deeply at what was taken from us because we have not looked at the great river civilizations of Africa. Now, this is a great concern for a lot of people, but because of our number in the world and how we are dispersed in the world, we're supposed to be winning. Some of the great wealth in the world is in our hands. 98% of the gold, the gem diamonds, comes out of Africa. The bulk of the gold comes out of Africa. Most of the cobalt comes out of Africa. Manganese out of Africa. 2/3 of the copper in the world comes out of Africa. Great deal of the zinc and the lead in the world comes out of Africa. If we united African people all over the world, we could close down American industry. And if we develop a good agriculture as we had before, our people could be fed indefinitely, and we could eat indefinitely, and we could go to school indefinitely, and say that if you don't want to pay my price for my goods, then I'll keep it. And they tell you, eat it. We don't have to eat it. We got corn. We got pigs. We got everything. We got cattle. We got sheep. We got goats. Our people going to eat whether we sell it or not. Our cards and failed to put the cards down. All right. Someone has sent me a book that they've been working on a number of years. I didn't think he'd quite bring it off. Because Why We Lose. Take Beeson of Minnesota, Indiana. He has addressed himself to the question, but inasmuch there's so many of us in the world, so strategically located, why are we losing? And why are smaller people winning? And why are we losing in the face of that? And we need to ask some critical questions. With all the things in our hands, with all the resources that can be made available to us, why are we losing? I think we're looking at ourselves in the wrong way. And we're asking the wrong things from each other. Farrakhan wants a separate state in Africa. I said, please, no. We don't need another Liberia. A sick nation where Black Americans and Caribbeans went. They say that they're going to civilize their heathen brothers. We don't need no condescending attitude toward Africans abroad and Africans in Africa. If we return to Africa, we will return and walk the same streets with the Africans, go to the same school, fight the same battles, and cry over the same defeat. No separation between African people and African people any place in the world. It's not needed. And if you think you're going to have a separate state in the United States, you're dreaming, because no white people are going to move aside and give you no state. You can have a multiplicity of miniature states. Your community, you can make your community into a miniature state. And there are places in the rural South where most of the county is Black. You can gain control of that county, gain control of these small cities. Now, there are places where we can have a high degree of sovereignty or we can practice for the kind of skills that we will take out to Africa. But the whole separate state concept is impractical. We have to stop dissipating so much energy on impractical projects. Pare ourselves down to what is realizable. Now, before going back to the question, can we be an African people again? Let's define what an African people are, what they are, and let's define what happened to the Africanness of African people. And let's look at to what extent are we still an African people and don't seem to know it. Living in rural Alabama, in Georgia, and traveling in Africa, I've seen identical traits. I've seen cultural manifestations no different from one place than the other. And if you tell the Black American he's doing something African, he want to hit you. And yet, through genetic transference, he still maintains so much that is Africa. What sustained Africa those many years before the foreigner? What did he create within himself that he had a society where he not only had no jails, but no word in his vocabulary that meant jail? He created a system where man's function was to bring people in harmony with nature. There's some aspects of it that may work for them, but our concept of consensus in talking that the Europeans call palaver, African Parliament, that proceeds. We need to look at that again. What can we draw from that? We need to look at our families again. And I need to look at my own family, and when there was debates and my great-grandmother was alive, and finally she would listen to the debates, and then she would render an opinion based on it. If there was any dispute, all she had to do was to stand up and tap her cane on the floor, which means the court is over, the decision is in, no further conversation. She had said the wisest thing. She'd given it all kind of thought. She sat there and listened patiently to everybody's argument. She'd analyze the argument and reach a decision. And that was our Supreme Court. And she was nearly always right. She was one of the great loves of my life, because anytime anybody wanted to punish me, she would say, send the boy to me. And I start laughing inside. 108 years old, how hard can she hit? Felt more like hugging to me. The whipping was of short duration, but the lecture would last the rest of the evening. She would tell me the story. I think we have grown too much away from each other, and we have not listened to each other. We have not consulted farms that we created. I don't know who Robert is, who did it, Robert's Rules of Order. And if he's alive, and I hope I got enough sense to choke him when I find him, he spoiled more meetings. Point of order, Mr. Chandler. Point of information, Mr. Chandler. I always holding up where if you can listen, talk consensus, the whole meeting will be over in a little while. Because the best thinkers among you will arrive at a consensus based on what's on the floor. And you'd have the best opinion you're going to get. All right, now, how did we lose being an African people, in as much as, in spite of foreigners, we continue to be an African people all over the world until about the end of the 19th century. Outside of Africa, the most African place in the New World was the Caribbean islands and parts of Brazil. How is it that 50 years later, they become Black English, Black French, Black Spaniards, Black Dutch, and forgot about it? When they had brought off some of the most successful slave revolts in history based on the cohesiveness of their Africanness. How do we get it back? We can get it back by looking at what kind of success we had when we communicated one to the other. We should examine very critically what other people are saying about us. We should examine very critical the people who say that they are our friends when they are the people trying to take a community away from us. There are too many things happening in this city that we have not examined. We should examine the concept of planned shrinkage, a plan to drive the poor out of New York and make it the bedroom for the middle class. They don't want poor whites in the city either. Poor whites won't even be able to pay the rent. Now, if a man makes sandwiches at a luncheonette, and he's good at it, why shouldn't he have a decent home? Why must he be some kind of an executive to get a decent place to stay? Now, in an African setting, where the king was in charge of the distribution of goods and services, he would get a place commensurate with his needs, irrespective of his ability to pay. This was a form of socialism. And they did not call it socialism. They didn't call it anything. They just lived it out. And what did the Europeans do? Formalize it and dogmatize it and came back to sell you what you had in a much better form before you know they existed. And that's what is still happening. That's what's happening in our courts. That's what's happening in relationship to the disintegration of our community. That's what's happening with the control of image. That's what's happening with the bad movies being made. That's what's happening with Spike Lee's misconception of the black college and the black college president. It's happening because we are not controlling the image and we are not controlling the curricula. In New Orleans, speaking with two college presidents on the subject of the future of the predominantly black colleges, I said, I cannot speak on the future of the predominantly black colleges because I don't know one predominantly black college. Because I don't know one, I will address myself to what would a black college look like if it did come into being, if it dared to be black. What kind of curricula would it have? It would have what the students at Howard University were demanding, an Afrocentric curricula. It's a contradiction in terms for students at Howard to demand an Afrocentric curricula at a black school because at a black school, that's the only kind of curriculum you should have. At Brandeis and Yeshiva, you've got a Jewish-oriented curriculum. They don't apologize for having it. They said, this is what it is. Now, they didn't say, don't come here. But they said, if you come here, this is the curriculum. We're not going to change it to suit you. Black schools should be good enough to train any student of any race and any religion in the country and still have a curriculum that predominantly favors black people all over the world. If you go to Harvard, Harvard was found as a Protestant school to train the future rulers of the United States. It's not going to change its curricula for anyone. It's going to remain. One of the Blyden brothers went to Harvard and he's going to get a degree in political science. And they seem to remind him every day that Ralph Bunche was the last person who got a degree in political science, and that certain things are expected of you if you get a degree in political science at Harvard. And so they set him down as committee, and he thought that because 3 of the members of the committee was his personal friends, that he had it made. So they asked him, who is your political hero? He said, Parnell. This man don't talk nonsense. Parnell, an Irish patriarch who blew a revolution chasing after some English woman. That we will not give you a PhD at Harvard if your hero failed in his mission. He must succeed in his mission, even he had to step over his mother. He have to politically succeed in his mission. And so he thought about it and took some time off. He came back, wrote the PhD thesis in 45 days, and asked, who's your hero? He said, Cromwell. This is good. Cromwell chopped off a few heads here and there, killed the king, but he succeeded. He held England together. Had to spill a little blood here and there, but he didn't fail. He wanted business in England, so the Jews had been expelled from England. He brought them back. Now, this was a lesson, is that Harvard is set up to train people whose focal point and whose hero worshiping must be focused on people who succeeded no matter how, and not dreamers who dreamed the dream and got solved and blew the deal chasing after a lady. And what I'm saying is that if you take Hamilton Institute, any institute, a black curriculum must have good courses in African history, not just a subject that allude to it. It must have good courses in African womanhood. It must show now that one of the main reasons why the status of women was so much different in Africa is that the African recognized early in life something which Western men still are not ready to recognize: the duality of relationships and how he would have to put both of them together to create a single relationship. That's why the king is referred to in the masculine gender. The king, in order to be total, had to have both the masculine and the female gender. And that you could not be a god without having a goddess. You only half of a god until you get a goddess. And when you look back at how all of it started, when you go back 10,000 years, when you look at the status of the Europeans and all that ice, seasons are short, he's got a short time to harvest the crop. 4 months, he's got to plant, harvest, and store. The wife must work. Every hand must work. If he gets angry with his wife and tell her to get out, she has to cop a plea to stay in. Because where is she going to go in all that ice? And if she goes to another household, that's another mouth to feed. So she's not welcome there. So she was beholden to him from the beginning. And this is part of her psyche of being beholden to him. She was never free, and she's not free now. Only now she's a slave on an air-conditioned auction block. Okay, you look at Africa, where the women started agriculture. The women got tired of the man going on to hunt. She began to plant gardens. She began to have a food supply so close to the house. And when she said, "Where are you going?" "I'm going on hunt." "No, we got enough food on. Stay on." The forest was a drugstore. If you get ill, she can go into the forest and find some plant that will cure him. She prepared the food. She took care of the children. And when you married her, you didn't marry an individual. You married a dynasty. When you wanted to marry her, you didn't consult her. You consulted the head of her family, who called a council of the uncles. Then the females called a council. Then the other side met. And both sides agreed. Then you could make the approach. She's part of a totality. If you're a cattle raiser, each side gives 10 head of cattle. The uncles give 10. So now, before they are married, they got 30 cows. Look at the mechanism put together. A lot of people feel ill at ease when I say that the romantic marriage is a Western invention. The "I love you" marriage. It lasts through the season. Sometimes it lasts through the summer. It may be gone by the winter. I'm talking about "I respect you" marriage. When you're putting together two families, sometimes two villages are coming together. Now suppose he get a knock on the head and get a little foolish and tell her to get out. She'd look at him like a fool and say, "Who's going to prepare your food? Who's going to take care of your children? Who's going to go to the forest and get something to cure you when you're sick?" And besides, if she had to go out, there's plenty of places to go. She ain't got to go in no snow. You see the independence from the beginning? And the independence did not mean dominance. It did not mean what white women live think it means. It did not mean what you are foolish enough to think it means. It did not mean that you got to declare war on him. The line came down through her side of the family, matrilineal. The foreigners introduced patrilineal. Nearly all African societies are matrilineal. That means in most cases the king's son can never be king, but the king's sister's son can be king, eliminating competition. There are exceptions, the Zulus are exceptions, they're patrilineal. And yet in a patrilineal society like the Zulus, when Clarke, after the death of his mother, Ninda, when he decreed that there'd be no crop planted for a year, people accepted that. There was enough meat and wild vegetables. They can survive a year without planting anything. No big deal. 15,000 men to guard the mother's grave for a year. No problem. So they go and guard the grave. Then he said, no, he maimed the cows so that they could mourn for the passing of his mother. Nobody complained. Then he said, no cohabitation for a year. The old ladies came together, said that our king is crazy. He has outlawed life itself. We cannot continue as a people if he's going to stop this activity. This item will not be so important except that I'm showing you that in a patrilineal society where that is male-oriented, the female council had enough power to order the ceremonial death of the king. Before he goes up to the moon, he's going to communicate with the gods and the spirits to give him the sign. If he don't get the sign, he ain't going. Is it all right with his God? Is it all right with his spirituality? This can get confusing because a whole lot of people think the Africans created a religion. Don't ever charge this crime to the Africans. I'm using my words advisedly. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam have been turned into murder cults because once they emerged, they began to be used to justify the murder of other people. Christianity said if he's an infidel, he has no soul, and it's all right to murder him, it's all right to enslave him. Judaism said if he's not of our faith, it's all right. Islam said if he's not of our faith, we can put him to the sword. The Africans created an overall spirituality and a God of love. These foreigners who misunderstood African spirituality created gods of vengeance and created what I call a carbon copy of African spirituality. I am not less religious, I am more, because I say examine the carbon copies and entertain the idea of going back to the original. I didn't say change God. I didn't say change churches. I said change concepts, change approaches. Stay where you are, but look at it in a different way. Because the Africans created an overall spirituality where all life was under God, was a manifestation of God. And he did not have a weekend religion. He had a religion that was operational on his life every single day of the week. He did not have to build a temple with a whole massive space for praying because he could pray anywhere. Akhenaten, who is accused of giving the world monotheism, and that's not true, and the Jews who said they gave the world monotheism, and that's not true. Monotheism the concept of the oneness of God was here all along. Akhenaten never said he gave the world monotheism. All Akhenaten did was to deal with the corrupt priesthood of his day that was restricting the movement of people based on the fact that if you go in a certain area, you're not under protection of God. Because I'm the one that controls the message of God. All Akhenaten said that God was omnipresent. God was omnipotent. God was everywhere. God was in the wind. If you want to pray, pray to the wind. God was in the tree. God was in a lowly cockroach. But most important, God was in you. You look inside of yourself. Now, if you look at what the Africans gave the world, and if you read W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin, you will find essays on the duality of American black. 2 souls in 1 body, 2 personalities. What the African gave the world is a form of duality. And when we look at duality, the Africans use conflict to solve conflict. He used conflict to horn one conflict against the other and to arrive at a synthesis between the 2 conflicts. So therefore, conflict did good because conflict presented him with the opportunity of arriving at a synthesis in between the 2 conflicts. Now, if you understand what I'm saying, you will understand that neither Du Bois or Booker T. Washington was wrong. And yet, the difference of opinion between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington gave us the opportunity to analyze both of them and arrive at a conclusion that will not be positively Booker or positively Du Bois. And that is called synthesis. A way of solving a problem by looking at both sides of the problem and extracting from both sides what you need to form a single solution. We have stopped doing this because we were forced into a society that was individual as against the society that produced us that was plural. When you come out of a plural society, you are tolerant of different opinions. There were many ways of worshiping in Africa, but the Africa knew one thing: while there were different ways of worshiping, that there was one spiritual force for the universe. Different ways of approaching the spiritual force, but the spiritual force remained the same, while the concept and the approach varied from one culture to the other. Now, Western man thinks this is a conflict, and it is not a conflict. If we were ever African people again, we would understand that, and we would understand that you cannot lift an African people with the slave master's concept of a religion that was created out of your spirituality in the first place. Because he has a one-dimensional approach, and you had a pluralistic approach to the same religion. Many ways of approaching it without changing the central message of the religion itself. What you got to look at is something that frightens a lot of people and something some black people might want to kill you for doing. You've got to look at the Hebrew entry. When you look at the Hebrew entry in the mythology about that entry, you begin to understand something. They came from an individualistic society in Western Asia. They began to copy and individualize African folklore and to project it to their own understanding of culture as against the African understanding. And not knowing African rule of morality, they began to violate these rules, and the African, with his customary kindness towards strangers, did not punish them for violating the rules. Because at this time, they began to violate women without any punishment and without any marriage. They began to produce. Now, this is the historical origin of black teenage pregnancy. The farm. When I delivered a talk on it and didn't take the brothers to task, the ladies who invited me got a little angry. Now, the brothers got a proper share of blame, but I wasn't discussing the present. I was discussing the historical origin. The foreign entry who did not understand the culture of Africa and had the Africans expel the foreigners for violating his rules, it would have been better, but the African looked with some kind of toleration because the foreigner did not understand the rules, not knowing that the foreigner's children would start conflict between African and African that would last for 3,000 years and is not settled to this day. Once we understand how the mulatto problem almost destroyed the Haitian Revolution and why the same problem turned Jamaica into a sick political child, you don't understand what I'm talking about. But there's certain things we sweep under the rug, but there's no more room under the rug now. Now we're going to have to turn back the rug and deal with it, because we have to deal with a loyalty system. We cannot build a nation with any large number of people within the nation who have a question as to whether they are loyal to us or their father. Everybody in the house must be loyal to the house or get out of the house. Because this is a time of great emergency when our very existence is at stake. Now, when you look at the Hebrew entry, 70 in numbers, and we're to believe their records as recorded in the Bible, entered 70 in numbers led by their patron, Abraham, leave 600,000 in number, and leave because the Africans, with their customary kindness, understand that they were collaborators with the first invaders of Africa, called the Shepherd Kings. Instead of putting upon them and punishing them, the Africans said, if you are now ready to obey African law, now that the Africans are back in power, you may stay. Otherwise, you have to go. the 600,000 were the ones who decided to go. But they come into Africa with no clear language, no clear religion, and no clear culture. And when they left, they had all three. Africa had made them a people, and they were never grateful to it. They never returned the favor, and they never sent a thank you note. They copied the African folklore, they copied the meaning of the Bible from African books, books that the Africans had created before. There is a book recently published called The Awakening Osiris. And this book deals with a simplified approach to African books written before the Bible. The most interesting, the one, only two I'll call to your attention. One is the book of Hunafa. That means the Palace of Hunafa, written by somebody named Hunafa. When the Egyptians say, we came from the headwaters of the Nile, near the mountain of the moon where the great God Happy dwells, as Kilimanjaro. It's significant because the ancient Egyptians identify their origin in spite of all the nonsense trying to make them white. They said in their literature where they came from. There's a whole library of books to prove it. This is why the book called the Tablets of the Book of Hunafa is important. It's part of the Book of the Dead, and sometimes published separate. But there's another book we need to look at. That's the book of Kananu. Because there was a man, Kananu. I remember Asa Hilliard calling this to our attention. There was another man who thought they could get some money from him. And so Kananu was on his way to sell his products, farm products. So this man put his clothing down across the road. If Kananu went around the clothes, you had to go through the man's cornfield so he could sue him for going to his cornfield. And if he went over the clothes, he would sue him for messing up his clothes. So Kananu went before the court and started defending himself. He defended himself so well, saying what the king's supposed to do, what the council's supposed to do, his rights as a human being, how he was wrong. And finally they told the king said, keep him talking and write it down. Because he was laying down a law for the country by saying what the country should be doing. He was laying down a law better than the country had. And so they took his ranting and made it into law. This is the significance of a common man on his way to market and someone trying to find a way to do him in, and he goes before the court to plead his case. And his plea becomes part of the law of that day. These are the books that came long before the Bible. I'm not saying you need not read the Bible. I'm saying except for these books, there would have been no Bible. I did not say choose one over the other. I said that both of them need attention. Yes. Thank you. Both of them need attention. And you need to pay attention to African problems of problem solving before something called European civil law entered that did not understand African methodology of problem solving. All right. The problem in Africa today in every single country is that you do not have in administration in Africa a single African country. Not one. You do not have a single African country that fashioned its government after a theory developed by Africans. You have an educated African running the country, trying to develop parliamentary government that they took from the people who educated them without understanding that that same government is not working so well for the people who taught it to them. Democratic government is not working so well for the people who said they believed in democracy.